In this video, we are going to be talking about endgames, a topic that some of you have been asking me to cover. And I'll try to go through at least some useful principles that can be applied to all endgames. So this is an example from a student of mine. White is doing perfectly fine here with the king in the center on e2, the knight in the center on d4. And the only thing to really worry about here is this pawn. But black doesn't even bother pushing it because if you push it, I mean, it's not going anywhere. The king can just come in and the knight and king do a great job of controlling the pawn. I mean, I suppose if black keeps pushing it, you might want to be a little careful about taking it because there is some kind of trick like this. Might not even be that big of a deal because you can go king d2 and step into this relationship because right now the bishop is actually under attack. And if the bishop moves, well, then it's a question of what is the rook threatening? She might not be threatening all that much here, right? Even if it was black's turn. Anyway, let's go back because if they do go here, you can also just play rook c1. I should mention that, and the pawn is lost. After rook c3, king e2, you're still going to pick it up. So black saw no real point in pushing the pawn. They went bishop c3, not a very poisonous move. And I think the most obvious response is the piece activation with rook b1. There is an obvious open file for this rook to enjoy. And after they trade, I mean, with this kind of rook, there's really no problem. But white made a rather strange rook move, putting the rook in front of the pawn instead of on the open file. And after king e6, king d2, king d5, king c3, well, black's king is more active than white's, and now their rook is threatening to get to the second rank. And white faces a big decision. I mean, should they try to guard the second rank because they can, or should they abandon it and still go for rook activity? It's not obvious. But as so often in rook endgames, the best strategy is activity. So you should just let their rook in and do the same thing on their seventh rank. And basically, white's active rook is going to be enough to give them a draw. All right. I mean, black can take another pawn first, but I think at some point there's just too many pawns coming off the board. You know, we can go and disturb the king. If he moves back, then this pawn is going to hang. We can go even for this. You know, something is going to fall here, and there's just going to be two little pawns on the board. But instead, white plays rook to c2. Yeah, being tempted into a scenario where it doesn't look clearly losing, and you know, you figure you can sort of hold this position. But the problem is that it's passive, right? The black king and the black rook are just better than their counterparts. And instead, instead of some activity, white is just resigned to moving the rook on the second rank, while black is going to make progress on the king side. And just by advancing the h-pawn, they basically just want to get it down the board. The only way to stop it is moving this pawn, but that weakens the e3 square. So the huge difference in the rook and king activity is what is deciding this seemingly simple position in black's favor. So black just goes after the pawns. And there's not much that white can do. They lose one pawn, they lose a second pawn, and the game ends in black's favor. So what can we say about this example, guys? Well, we can say that rooks definitely appreciate the open files, that sometimes we even prefer to sacrifice material like a pawn in order to have an active rook. And now let's move on to our next example. So this one is an endgame with an imbalance of minor pieces, bishop versus knight. Also, an imbalance in the pawn structure, with each side having a pawn majority in a different part of the board. The way I see it, black's pawn structure is favorable because of white's doubled pawns. It's not like a really big deal. I mean, the pawns are not isolated. They're part of this configuration, but with doubled pawns, it's always harder to move them. So the moment I see this position, and I kind of recognize the pawn structure favors black a bit, I'm like, well, in what scenario does white actually lose a position like this? Well, white can lose a position like this if black's pawns, let's say, go to these dark squares, making it hard for white to ever get rid of these or to push any pawns. And then somehow, black will try to use their extra pawn on the queen side, right? So that's like a very, very in the future kind of scenario, guys, right? Because I mean, white is nowhere close to losing. But still, it is helpful to see what could be that scenario where I lose, right? So of course, as white in general, like I'm trying to put my pawns like this, making sure that my pawns retain some mobility. Now, let's see what happens just a few moves in this game. Rook d6. And now black, the higher rated player, decided to make a rather strange move, I guess, to keep the game going, avoiding the trade of pieces. I mean, leaving the open file, it doesn't look really impressive. And white played rook d2, which is okay as a move, right? Because, I mean, again, nothing much is happening. You can do a lot of different things as white. You're nowhere close to losing. But really, why are we not trying to put our pawns like this? This is where the pawns belong, right? So this move, I just feel like it has to be played. You got to put pawns an opposite color from your bishop. You want to take space. You want to make sure the knight can't go there. And the only reason to not do it is, like, of course, there are some tactical ideas of black on the f-file. They just happen to not be very dangerous. In this position, okay, we had kind of a big transformation, but the black king got kind of kicked further from the center. Black's pawn over here is a bit weak, and you can either go here or here, challenge the active rook, and white is completely fine. So if black wants to go down that route with g5, they can. If they don't, white will probably be playing h4. So white played rook d2, and again, it's not a big problem, but you see, finally this move happens, right? It's exactly the scenario we didn't really want to let happen because now our pawns are less mobile. Of course, white is still able to find counterplay, right? The idea like that, and white is fine. But still, guys, I would prefer to not get stuck with that pawn on f3. So this example is kind of like about seeing the problems down the line, right? Of course, your position is fine. It can take a lot, but there is a little bit of an issue with pawn structure. So you want to iron that out before, sometime in the near future, before the problem is unsolvable, right? Okay, in the end, yeah, eventually, not ever solving this problem, white manages to lose this game. Now let's look at a classic game between Padevsky and Vasily Smyslov. So Smyslov forces a queen trade with this move. And because of the attack on the queen and bishop, white has no choice but to accept and improve the black pawn structure. Because yes, capturing towards the center and going higher up the board is an improvement of the pawn structure, despite the fact that pawns are doubled. Now, how to react as white? So there are some good things about white's position and some not so good things, right? Because we do have a bishop endgame on the board. And we actually have a lot of pawns on the same color as our bishop. That's not a fantastic scenario for white. It's something to kind of keep an eye out on. And that's really the main issue. And also this pawn is actually quite strong, like the way it kind of clamps down on our pawns. So when I gave this position to my student, I was actually quite pleased with their approach, which was the move h3. Because it showed me that they kind of learned the lesson, right? That little problems need to be addressed early. And so what is the problem that white is addressing? They're addressing the problem of space. They're basically saying, all right, if you take me, it's just going to be a trade of pawns. I've traded off your space, made these pawns more mobile, and yeah, that's going to help me not experience problems in this game. By the way, you don't really have the move f5 because I'm going to target that pawn and there's nobody to defend it. So I think h3 is just a great solution, fighting for space. But now let's see how, actually the much more experienced player, Badevsky, handled this position. So he decides not to challenge the space. And for a while, not much is happening. It's a bit of a weird move, blocking in the bishop, but the pawn will move forward soon enough. It's basically to improve the king that he did that. f5. And you sort of see, when I see this position, I do see the outline of how white can lose, because I see these pawns are really quite good. They give white a lot of space. This pawn can't move anymore, right? So this pawn never got challenged. The space never got challenged. And that's already a little seed for a potential loss. It doesn't mean white's losing. It just means the scenario for how white can lose just got more realistic. White played here and c6. Kind of an unusual move. Breaking up the mini pawn chain. White probably captured the wrong way, and black got to do this. Now black is threatening different ideas with d4, so white did that here, here, and here. And black's position is just getting better and better. Remember, this pawn, yes, can be a target. The black king is more active. I mean, this is such a wonderful part of black's position, that pawn structure. It's free space. And by the way, let's notice one thing. We've got dark squared bishops on the board. All of white's pawns are in dark squares, making them all potential targets. And all of black's pawns are on light squares. Coincidence, isn't it? No, guys. That's because you got to pay attention to pawn structure when there's bishops on the board, for sure, because that makes for targets for the bishop. So here we go. I guess the trade here is not that perfect for maybe... Actually, I kind of wonder how black would capture, because they're both possible. Certainly, that's kind of tempting to try to get the king in here. But white avoided the trade. And yes, a5 became a problem. If you take it right now, there's counterplay down the a file, so black did not take it. Went back to f6, and then white blundered by walking into this deflection trick where they either lose the c3 pawn or they lose their bishop. So, obviously white could have played this endgame better, I think, at many points, right? And so what I really wanted to kind of stress to you guys is the long-term impact of allowing your opponent to keep certain nice parts of their position, right? So what I would say is look at what makes your opponent's position nice and try to challenge it as early as you can, right? Because it might not be obvious to you how you might lose the game because there's a pawn sitting on g4, but that pawn represents space. And that pawn could, at some point, single-handedly be immobilizing 3 of your pawns, right? So just deal with that problem, because it's clear that that pawn is a good part of black's position, and fight for space. And finally, guys, even though I'm not giving you a specific example on this theme in this video, I think I do want to mention that for all endgames that you play, you have to think about what piece trades are acceptable for you, right? Can I go all the way into a king and pawn endgame? Do I need you know, to stay in like a rook end game, or do I need it to be more than a rook, like a rook and a bishop, bishop and queen, right? So it's like every single piece trade, like it could be not so important. It could be like, it's fine to trade this, it's fine to trade that. But then there could be a point where like, no, no more trades. Like I can't possibly enter the king and pawn endgame. So those are things that you need to think about, like which, ratio of pieces you kind of need to keep on the board, right? Because it could be a difference. Like, do I need two rooks and a bishop? Do I need one rook and a bishop on the board? So, yeah, kind of ask yourself those big picture questions as you're playing. Which of these end game balances is actually acceptable for you?